Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 35 of Humanity versus Insanity. It seems quite a while since I was last here in the studio in the southwest of England, and a lot of water has got under the bridge since then. Of course, in episode 34, my guest was Ken O'Keefe, and we were discussing the change in attitudes as certain events transpired, particularly in Sydney and in Paris. And of course, in the last 48 hours, there has been yet another turn of events which bear a remarkable similarity to those of Sydney and Paris. But more of that later. In fact, this week I have just come back from the north of England, where I had 5 events in total there. And I just want to acknowledge the wonderful generosity of the people who stepped forward to ensure that I was able to fulfill those commitments. Unfortunately, my trusty Rover 75 estate decided to let me down Friday week ago. And I had a weekend to try to arrange other transport. And people came forward, and I was able to meet all those commitments without any problems. So thanks very much for that. There are indeed some wonderful people out there, which is why I draw great encouragement from the title of this program, Humanity versus Insanity. And of course, the reality is that the greater the insanity, then the more likely it is that people will step out of their trance and start to realize that we are living literally in a barless prison. They say the pen is mightier than the sword. Well, we're certainly kept in or under the thumb by the stroke of a pen rather than the sword. And over the next few weeks in the UK, there is no question that more and more of these issues are going to come to the fore. If we look at what's occurring in the UK right now, it can only be described as absolute insanity. Of course, in the last week or so, news has broken about the tax fraud. Of course, it's not considered fraud by those who believe themselves to be above the law. It's simply called tax efficiency. And the corporations employ great rafts of tax lawyers whose role is to research the loopholes in the various international tax laws to maximize the efficiency, in other words, minimize the amount of tax they pay, and to ensure that the bottom line, i.e. the profitability, is as great as possible. This is called achieving shareholder value. Well, I can certainly attest from my days in the oilfield services industry that no stone was left unturned when it came to seeking ways in which the company could avoid paying any kind of corporation tax. And of course that applies to individuals, and taxes are for the poor people, taxes are for the proletariat. And hopefully what this is going to flag up is that the tools that those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers and their minions, the tools that they use are actually available to everybody else. And hopefully, as the year rolls on, some of those tools will come into the public domain, and I encourage people to make use of them. But I offer a caveat here. When we pay taxes, we have no choice as to where that tax revenue disappears to. And in many cases, of course, it disappears into foreign aid, which is completely unnecessary. And of course, it also goes into funding military excursions. And as we know, over the last decade plus, those military excursions have been nothing if not unlawful. Whereas if one is able to find ways of tax efficiency, then the money that one saves, perhaps one should use to ensure that it goes to causes that you choose. So this isn't a question of looking to escape one's social responsibility. It's a question of seeking alternatives to ensure that however it is that you choose to, or where you choose to put your money, you can be sure that it actually ends up where you want it to. Well, we are now less than 80 days before the UK general election, and there is no question there is certainly much that needs to be discussed, not least the fact that I think it's an inevitability that we are once again looking at a coalition government after May the 7th. The issue is, will it be a far-right coalition between the Tories and UKIP? In which case, God help us. Because in that situation, there is no doubt that there will be a continuing assault on the lower ends of society, those who through no fault of their own find it extremely difficult to earn a living wage. The spread of 0 hours contracts and the increase in minimum wage jobs forcing ever increasing numbers into poverty. It's now estimated that some 13 million people, approximately 20% of the population of the UK, allegedly a first world country, now live in poverty. Of course, the pressure is put on them by the media and the TV programs such as Benefit Street, demonizing those who have the audacity to extract benefits from the state. Yet in reality, the vast majority of those people are not necessarily in that situation of their own choosing. Whatever happened to compassion? Whatever happened to understanding? Whatever happened to basic humanity? Well, in the run-up to the election, I'm going to be undertaking my first UK tour for nearly 2.5 years. 2 years ago, of course, I did do a UK tour to focus on raising awareness of the issue of hydraulic fracturing or fracking. And more of that later at 9 o'clock this evening with the latest episode of Fracking Nightmare. But this will be my first tour looking at the bigger picture and looking at the situation as it is likely to unfold after the UK elections. And the title of this tour is Apathy Kills. Apathy Kills, the greatest threat to humanity ever. Now, I did an Australian version of this when I was out there in November of last year, and I did a trial run in the UK in St Anne's a couple of weeks ago. I'm pleased to say that the presentation was very well received, and of course I will always ensure that it is topical and incorporating the latest developments. Now, the tour starts in Liverpool on Wednesday the 11th of March, and it will continue right through until Friday the 1st of May. Now, all of the venues, the locations and venues are on the screen there, but if it's a little bit difficult for you to read, then please go to my website, which is www.ianrcrane.com, where you can see the full list of details, a synopsis of the presentation, and you can book your tickets. Now, there will be a small charge for these events. Unfortunately, I cannot make these public events. There is no external funding. But all of the revenue that is generated from these events is either going directly towards the cost of staging these events, and any surplus will go towards maintaining these broadcasts of Humanity versus Insanity through 2015. So there is absolutely going to be time for Q&A, and the purpose of this tour is to build on this emerging socio-political movement, which is completely unique. I've referred to it previously as an amorphous, asymmetrical political initiative. It's one where there is no leaders. It's one where there is no hierarchy. But it's where people acknowledge that they have common interests, common goals. And that is centered around a desire to provide a better standard of living for all parts of society. The upper echelon are milking this country dry. They are bleeding the people. And we all know this is something that isn't right. It cannot, will not, and should not be tolerated. Collectively, we can bring about the change. We've seen that with the quest to prevent this country from being assaulted by the unconventional gas industry. From 2 years ago, when the moratorium was lifted on unconventional gas in the UK, this groundswell of awareness, which 2 years ago consisted of 4 groups, 4 anti-fracking groups in the country, 3 on the Fylde Peninsula in the Blackpool area and 1 in Sussex. Now there are over 300 groups. It is the fastest growing social movement in this country. And it's something that we have an opportunity to build upon, to expand the portfolio beyond hydraulic fracturing. Perhaps it's TTIP, perhaps it's GMOs, who knows? Whatever it is that we almost all agree upon, and we can concentrate on those issues where we do agree, rather than getting bogged down on those issues where we disagree, which is of course what the establishment wants, that's divide and conquer. And we have a tremendous opportunity to bring about the changes that we know we need to see. Now, after the election, in fact 1 week after the election, we have the next Alternative View event. Now this is AV6. The last one was the same weekend last year. It's at the same venue. That's the Staverton Park Hotel in Daventry. Now, it is a residential event, and the primary purpose of that is to provide everybody there with the opportunity of socializing with each other, building networks, and of course, having time to sit down with the speakers. So the confirmed speakers for this event are Ken O'Keefe, who of course is a regular guest here on Humanity versus Insanity, Patrick Henningsen, who's been for the best part of the year in the United States, and he'll be returning to the UK to share his insights of the emerging geopolitical agenda. Thomas Sheridan be coming back from Southern Ireland to share his insights. Pippa King, a remarkable lady who has been at the forefront of fighting the biometric and RFID agenda. And much of this she has done absolutely single-handed. So Pippa has much to share with us. And in addition to myself, there'll be Mark Darwin from Australia, along with his colleague, Mr. X, who these 2 guys have done an amazing job in Australia of helping people set up trusts. I'm sure you've all heard of Tony Blair's trust. Well, this is how those who think they're the rightful rulers and their minions actually, I would say avoid, but create tax-efficient vehicles. Well, the only difference is that they know the rules of the game, and for the vast majority of people, we don't. So here's an opportunity to learn the rules and to consider whether or not this is something that might be appropriate for you. And certainly if you're self-employed, let me tell you, this has some tremendous advantages. And returning again with his remarkable humour and poetry will be Simon Welsh. Now, there will be other speakers being added over the next couple of weeks, and I'll announce them on future episodes of Humanity versus Insanity. Now, I want to build up to the events of the last 48 hours or so, but I want to take a trip back, because many of you watching this program will recall this, or these, the Illuminati cards. Now, the Illuminati cards really first came on the scene back in the mid-1990s. They were developed by a games developer by the name of Steve Jackson, who was based in Texas. Now, Steve Jackson was one of the very first games developers to build interactive games using the emerging internet. And back in the early 1990s, his premises in Texas were raided and all of his computers taken away for analysis by the FBI. Now, call it a hunch, but I would say that Steve Jackson was not too amused by this. And what followed was Steve Jackson and his fellow games developers getting their heads together and coming up with a game which they called the Illuminati cards. And this was, I think there are something like about 240 odd cards now in various sets that have been issued over the years. But there has been some remarkable coincidences between these cards and events. And this was perhaps first fully recognized in the aftermath of Fukushima. But let's go back a bit further and let's take a look at 9/11, because these were two of the cards in the original pack. So these two cards actually date from the mid-1990s. And you can see the card on the left there, which is labeled Terrorist Nuke. And then the one on the right, the Pentagon with a fire from the center of the Pentagon. Now, it cannot have escaped your notice that that card, which predates the events of 9/11, bears a remarkable resemblance towards what transpired that day. You'll also note that there's no apparent planes in that card, just a terrorist nuke. Wonder if that card is actually closer to the truth than the official version of events. Well, the other card is also very interesting, the Pentagon, although of course, it wasn't a fire from the center of the Pentagon. It was supposedly Flight 77 flying into the side of the building. But let me share something with you that you may not be aware of, because a year before 9/11, well, not even, about 10 months before the events of 9/11, there was an exercise being conducted at the Pentagon. Now, exercises seem to be part of the template. In some cases, these exercises are going on in parallel with the actual false flag event. The purpose there being to provide cover in the event that somebody is discovered and they can say, oh, yeah, it was just an exercise, well done, you spotted it. But this exercise was developed by a former US naval pilot who was no longer part of the military. He was part of the reserve, but apparently he had a specialist area or specialist skill in developing these exercises. And the exercise was conducted over October 24th to 26th in the year 2000. And the exercise involved a plane crashing into the center courtyard of the Pentagon there. Now that game was developed by a pilot and remarkably, again, predating the events of 9/11, another Illuminati card. And here we see looks like could be a Navy pilot there, or a senior naval figure standing in front of the burning Pentagon. Now, the person that developed this game, the naval pilot, former naval pilot, was a guy by the name of Charles Burlingame. Charles Burlingame. Now, if you actually search and look for the name of the supposed pilot of Flight 77, which slammed allegedly into the side of the Pentagon on the morning of 9/11, 2001, you will find that pilot was none other than Charles Burlingame. Now, what are the chances? Isn't that a remarkable coincidence that Charles Burlingame, who developed the exercise a year before, should actually be the pilot on the American Airlines flight that slammed into the side of the Pentagon on the morning of 9/11? Well, funnily enough, Charles Burlingame's daughter never actually believed that Charles Burlingame was piloting that flight. And try as she might to get to the bottom of the truth, funnily enough, she couldn't do it. And sadly, Charles Burlingame's daughter was killed in an unexplained house fire some years ago. Well, the questions, of course, continue. Here we are at, what are we at now? 13 and a half years after the events of 9/11. And still, anybody who tells you they know exactly what occurred on 9/11 is perhaps not being completely honest. The reality is that, or let's say revolved in it, of course, the reality is that we know what didn't happen because the physical evidence does not support the official version of events, but we don't know for sure what did happen. But we also need to take a look at the various experts around the world. And one of the experts that caught my attention is this particular individual. Now, this is the former German cabinet minister, von Bülow. And he was the German Minister of Technology, Andreas von Bülow, at the time of 9/11. Now, interestingly, von Bülow was a very astute individual. And in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, he grounded all of Lufthansa's Boeings. And he had the avionics that were installed in those Boeings at the Boeing factory ripped out and replaced with Siemens avionics technology. So what did von Bülow suspect? Did von Bülow suspect that there was a back door into the avionics of the aircraft and that the flights that allegedly hit the Twin Towers and the Pentagon that morning were effectively hijacked by those who controlled the software? Well, von Bülow clearly wasn't going to take any chances, which is why the entire Boeing fleet in the Lufthansa airline was grounded and they were replaced. Well, ever since I learned that way back in 2002, I have watched the German security services very closely because they are clearly very astute. And one needs to actually acknowledge that these guys are nobody's fools. They are amazing analysts, and in most cases, they are indeed looking after the best interests of their population. So let's roll the clock forward, and we look at some more of the Illuminati cards. And what we have here is the early warning, the tidal wave, the earthquake projector, and a nuclear accident. And there was another card there, the combined disasters. And in fact, the clock on the tower on that combined disasters bears a remarkable similarity to a clock tower that is situated in Tokyo. Well, once again, bear in mind that these cards predated the events of 2011, where we had the tsunami, which allegedly triggered an earthquake. The earthquake triggered the tsunami, and then the tsunami, of course, poured into the Fukushima nuclear plant. Well, thanks to the investigative work of Jim Stone, Jim Stone was able to establish from Israeli news sources that the Israelis had recently installed the surveillance equipment right in the inner chamber of Fukushima power station. Now, Israeli security services don't have a great track record. Of course, let's remember that it was Israeli security services that were responsible for security at all of the airports where the planes took off on the morning of 9/11. It was an Israeli security service that had the contract for the closed-circuit TV on the London Underground at the time of July 7th, 2005. And here we are again, Jim Stone, identifying the fact that Israeli security services had installed the CCTV equipment in the Fukushima power plant. And Jim Stone makes the observation that the blast that was supposedly caused by the tsunami rushing into the nuclear station there bears a remarkable similarity to the signature of the blast at a nuclear test. So, of course, this is pure conjecture, but if we actually look at what occurred in the run-up to the events at Fukushima, we start to see some interesting parallels. So let me go back here. Sorry, rushing through a bit here. Let's bring this slide up on camera here. Bear in mind that watching the German security services can be very revealing. Well, I didn't even need to watch the security services here, because in the immediate aftermath of Fukushima, Germany announced that they were intending to shut down all their nuclear power plants. And in fact, Angela Merkel announced that she would work to shut down 5 almost immediately within the next 2 to 3 months, with the remainder being shut down over the next 5 to 6 years or so. And of course, she was basically making a statement that this was an opportunity to get out of nuclear power and move into renewables. Well, Germany had a very clean record in terms of nuclear energy. There hadn't been any problems. Obviously, Fukushima was a concern. But why would Germany make this statement literally in the hours immediately after Fukushima? Well, could it be that the German security services were concerned that what had really caused the Fukushima disaster was not the earthquake, was not the tsunami, although they were very convenient events, but what really triggered it was the Stuxnet virus. Now, the Stuxnet virus was specifically designed by a combination of CIA, MOSSAD software engineers, and it was specifically designed to target Siemens control systems in nuclear stations. The reason being was because it was believed or known that in Iran's nuclear facilities they had Siemens control systems. And Stuxnet was developed specifically to target the Iranian control systems in their nuclear facilities. But obviously, Fukushima was using the same system, as were all of the German nuclear facilities. So was the concern here that maybe Germany might become a target for those who controlled this virus? Well, this was Germany's nuclear network. As you can see, most of their nuclear stations were on rivers, as opposed to the likes in the UK, where they're on the coastal line. But let's have a look at why it was maybe that Japan was targeted, if it was targeted. Here's a statement from March the 11th, 2010, almost exactly 1 year before Fukushima. And this was a statement by Press Secretary and Director General for Press and Public Relations, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, on the decision of the government of Israel regarding the construction of housing units and settlements in West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So, which country was this secretary, this press secretary from? Japan. This was Japan, and this was Japan's first criticism of Israel, open criticism of Israel, since the Second World War. There we go, March the 11th, 2010. Well, then we have the US condemning vetoing the UN draft condemning Israeli settlements. Well, that was based on Japan's condemnation, but then Japan was also offering to enrich uranium for Iran. So Israel, could it be that it was sending a very strong message to Japan, basically saying, mess with us, criticize us, and the consequences will be extremely severe? Now, this may sound completely outrageous. It's meant to. You're meant not to believe it, so that these entities, those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom, can pull stunts like this, so that those that they are targeted at know full well what's occurring, but the vast majority of people would never believe that there is anybody on this planet capable of perpetrating such an event. Now, had Germany deliberately or otherwise, given away the fact that perhaps they suspected Israel of having a hand in the Fukushima disaster. Well, was there then an attack on Germany? Because in the immediate aftermath of this is May of 2011, you may recall that there was an outbreak of E. coli, which were allegedly in infected cucumbers. Not only infected cucumbers, but organic cucumbers. Well, then when it was decided, no, it wasn't cucumbers, maybe it was bean sprouts. Again, organic. So was this an attempt to demonize organic food at the same time? Well, then the Koch laboratories identified that the strain of E. coli that had caused these fatalities in Germany, and unfortunately a few other countries in Europe as people travelled between them, was bioengineered. And here's the article that appeared there. It said, forensic evidence suggests the recent outbreak of E. coli in Europe was bioengineered to resist antibiotics. The strain of E. coli is a member of the 0104 strain, which is usually never antibiotic resistant. Scientists at the Robert Koch Institute in Germany discovered the strain of E. coli is resistant to penicillin, tetracycline, nalidixic acid, etc., etc. In the simplest terms, the E. coli was exposed to each antibiotic, and those that were resistant were then exposed to the next antibiotic, and so on until a super weapon was created. So with this irrefutable evidence that the E. coli was bioengineered, which countries have the capability and the capacity to develop this? Well, the US, the UK, and Israel. Well, there's no reason for the UK or the US to unleash this on Germany, but there may well have been a good reason for Israel to do so on the basis that the Germans had inadvertently, perhaps, revealed the Israeli involvement in Fukushima. Well, of course, that all disappeared. You will remember that after literally a few days of headlines that this E. coli outbreak was virulent, it disappeared from the media. Because consider the possibility that a deal was cut and that Israel provided the antidote in return for keeping quiet about the E. coli and indeed about Fukushima. Well, perhaps one of the benefits from that is that Germany has indeed committed itself to shut down its nuclear stations and has developed renewables at a phenomenal rate of knots. And I believe I'm correct in saying that some 42% of Germany's power last year came from renewables. In the UK, we've gone from 2% to 11%. It was 2% in 2007, 11% in 2011, which is the latest year that I have the numbers for. But on the basis that we are moving in that direction, but Germany have shown just how quickly you can increase the renewables capacity if you have other motivation. Now, in the last few minutes of the program, I want to revisit the events of Sydney. And this occurred, of course, literally a few days after I returned to the UK. And these events in Sydney occurred approximately about 6 weeks after Tony Abbott, the Australian Prime Minister, had given a speech in the Australian Parliament stating that the Australian people would have to be prepared to give up certain freedoms in return for their security. And of course, the Australian people really weren't buying any of that. So what do you know? A few weeks later, we have this event in Sydney. And of course, it ends in a shootout. And as is the usual MO here, the perpetrators, unfortunately, don't live to tell the story. And, consequently, it's used for increased surveillance, increased monitoring, shutting down of civil liberties. Despite the fact that, there was a lot of people there, a lot of camera crews, and yet, although the questions are being asked about the veracity of the official version of events, nonetheless, they're trying to now say it's all over, it's all done, it's all dusted, but we're going to leave the removal of civil liberties in place. Then we had Paris. And as I discussed with Ken a few weeks ago, I'm just going to show this single still here from the video footage. And this is the moment that for many people, it proved that this was a false flag event. The guy with the semi-automatic weapon there, firing at the head, allegedly, of the police officer on the floor. The bullet appears to hit the pavement, but allegedly the police officer was killed with a shot to the head, yet there was absolutely no blood trauma evident in the video footage. Of course, this resulted in a mass demonstration, people from all over France congregating in Paris to let it be known that they would not be cowed by these events, and they expected their leadership not to restrict their freedoms. And here we have the show of strength of the leaders. Of course, it wasn't quite what it seems. It was indeed a photo opportunity. Then, of course, there's always strange occurrences in the aftermath of these things, and this is Eric Friedel, one of the police investigators who strangely committed suicide whilst he was investigating the events at the Charlie Hebdo offices. Well, of course, today, or yesterday, we had the events in Copenhagen. And once again, we're seeing the same MO here with calls for increased protection on the Jewish community and the demonization of the Muslim community. And as I was discussing with Ken O'Keefe in the last episode of Humanity vs. Insanity, Israel has literally gone now from a situation some 6 months ago where it was being vilified by the global community for its outrageous genocidal attacks on the Palestinian community, but now it is manipulating worldview against the Muslim extremists. But if I recall the work of Victor Ostrovsky, who back in the early 90s published a book about his days as a member of MOSSAD, as an agent with MOSSAD, and the book is called By Way of Deception, Thou Shalt Do War. And Victor Ostrovsky talks about how there were squads within MOSSAD who would literally go and perpetrate attacks on the Jewish community in cities around the world in an attempt to encourage the Jewish communities in those overseas cities to move to Israel. And this would seem to be exactly what's happening right now. Here we go. This is the Times of Israel today. After Copenhagen attack, Netanyahu urges Jews to move to Israel. And we saw the same after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France. And Mitterrand, that's a blast from the past. Hollande says, I will not let people believe that Jews no longer have a place in Europe. Hollande's fury after Netanyahu makes plea for mass emigration to Israel in the wake of anti-Semitic terror attacks. Now, according to the Jewish Agency, the number of French Jews that have been moving from France to Israel seems to have been increasing. You can see in 2013 there were some 3,000 French Jews that emigrated to Israel. But why is it that Netanyahu is now using these opportunities in Sydney, in France, and now in Denmark to try to encourage European Jews to move to Israel? And of course, there are significant financial incentives on offer for them to move to Israel. Well, could it be that many of the Jews who have been living in Israel are actually now looking to move out? So is there a concern perhaps by Netanyahu that if they don't find a way to attract new blood, fresh blood, into Israel, then eventually there won't be enough there to maintain order against the Palestinians. That's why perhaps that Netanyahu wants to accelerate the genocidal agenda to wipe out the Palestinian population from the West Bank and from Gaza, and ultimately from Greater Israel, everything between the Nile and the Euphrates. 40% of Israelis, according to Haaretz, 40% of Israelis are thinking of emigrating. Could it be that 40% of the population of Israel is getting rather tired of the Zionist agenda, this religio-extremist organization that is intent on the annihilation of the Palestinian people? Having lost the confidence of the international community after their last attack on the Palestinian people, they're now resorting to Gladio tactics, Operation Gladio style tactics, to try to sway public opinion. As is always the case, nothing is what it seems. The geopolitical agenda is being accelerated at a phenomenal rate of knots as the distribution of wealth becomes even more extreme, with the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, and the people at the lower end of society having to work every hour under the sun just to keep food on the table or a roof over their head, with pressures from governments to take away basic necessities from those who find themselves unable to fulfill a role in the global corporatist state. This is not humanity. This is insanity. You know, it's now nearly 30 years ago since Ronald Reagan said, you know, is there not an alien force already amongst us? That alien force is intent on subjugating humanity. It's only by coming together, it's only by recognizing the fundamentals of love and compassion. And if we have the means to step forward and help our fellow man when they are in need, and not kowtow to those who think they are the rightful rulers, at the end of the day, there is way more of us than there is of them. If you can join me on the Apathy Kills tour, or you wish to come and join the community at the AV6 event in May, we're going to be looking at strategies whereby over the next 5 years we can change the political dynamic in this country. Sadly, I don't think it really matters who gets into power on May the 7th of this year. Sadly, I think the corporatist agenda will be maintained. We have 5 years to find an alternative. It's my opinion that collectively we can do that. Collectively, we can change the whole dynamic with an amorphous, asymmetrical political initiative that the establishment has no idea how to deal with. Thank you for joining me this evening. Hopefully I'll see you in about 45 minutes on Fracking Nightmare.